The air inside the dining room felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Thomas Grant sat at the head of the table, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, staring down at the roast he could barely taste. Across from him, Nathan leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. Melissa sat beside him, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against her wine glass, her lips curved into that faint, knowing smile Thomas had learned to distrust years ago. "I'm done arguing about this," Nathan said sharply, slamming his palm on the table so hard the silverware rattled. "You can't live here anymore, Dad. This house is too big for you, and you're a danger to yourself." He shot Melissa a quick glance as if waiting for her approval. "We've already looked into assisted living facilities. You'd be better off there. Safer." Thomas didn't move. He didn't shout. His face stayed expressionless, but his knuckles tightened around the mug. Melissa finally spoke, her voice smooth and cold. "It's for your own good, Thomas. We can't keep worrying about you leaving the stove on or falling down the stairs. Nathan's right. It's time." And then Nathan said the one thing Thomas would never forget. "Look, let's not drag this out. Just pack up your things this month. Melissa and I will handle the rest. Once you're out, we can put this place on the market and finally use the money for something worthwhile." Through the open kitchen window, Mrs. Harper, the neighbor, froze in place while watering her garden. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but Nathan's voice carried into the night air. Thomas caught her glance through the glass. For a brief second, he saw pity in her eyes, the same look strangers give a man who's already lost. Something inside Thomas went very still. The anger didn't come right away. First came a cold, hollow silence that settled deep in his chest. Slowly, he placed the mug down, stood up from the table, and straightened his back. "I see," he said simply. That was all. No shouting. No begging. Just two words that made Nathan smirk like a man who believed he'd finally broken his father. Thomas turned and walked out of the room, his boots echoing against the hardwood floors he had installed with his own hands 23 years ago. In the living room, he paused. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and yet he felt the weight of its history pressing in on him. Every corner of this home carried memories. Christmas mornings when Nathan was still a wide-eyed little boy, summer barbecues where the neighbors gathered, late nights when Thomas had worked double shifts just to pay the mortgage. He stopped in front of the mantel where Ellen's picture still rested. His late wife's kind smile frozen forever behind glass. She had loved this house more than anything, had chosen the paint colors, the curtains, the bay window where she used to read every evening. Her voice echoed in his memory. "Promise me you won't let them take advantage of you, Thomas. You're too good for your own good." For a long moment, Thomas stood there in the dim glow of the hallway light, staring at her photo. Then he nodded once, slowly, as if answering her question. He walked upstairs, each step measured, and opened the door to Nathan's old room. The shelves were bare now, but he could still picture Nathan as a boy sitting cross-legged on the floor, building toy cars with Thomas's old tools. Back then, Nathan had wanted to be just like him. Somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. When he returned to the kitchen, Nathan and Melissa were gone, leaving behind their empty wine glasses like a pair of victory trophies. Thomas didn't clear the table. Instead, he pulled open the bottom drawer of the sideboard and retrieved an old folder thick with paperwork, mortgage receipts, repair bills, tax statements, his life's work, documented in black and white. He carried the folder into his study, sat down at the desk, and opened it with slow, deliberate movements. If Nathan thought this house would be his so easily, he had another thing coming. Thomas stayed in his study long after midnight, the house quiet except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The folder lay open on his desk, its contents spread out like the pieces of a puzzle he'd been ignoring for too long. Property tax bills, maintenance receipts. The final mortgage statement stamped paid in full. His name alone, sat printed in bold across the deed. This house was not just a structure. It was his life's work, his gift to Ellen, his legacy. But when Thomas flipped to the back of the folder, his stomach twisted. There, tucked between utility bills, was a letter addressed to Nathan from a local credit union. It was a notice of default, dated 3 months ago, warning that a personal loan was delinquent and would soon go to collections. A second envelope revealed something worse. Paperwork showing Nathan had tried to use the house's address as collateral on a separate business loan. The application had been denied, likely because the house wasn't in Nathan's name, but the very fact that he'd tried made Thomas's jaw clench. He sat back, breathing slow and even, letting the rage settle like sediment in water. It wasn't just that Nathan wanted him gone. Nathan needed the house gone. He needed the cash, and Melissa, Thomas was certain now, was pushing him to take it by force if necessary. The next morning, Thomas made coffee and sat at the kitchen table like nothing had happened. When Nathan came downstairs, still groggy, Thomas greeted him with a quiet, "Morning, son." Nathan hesitated, then sat across from him. "Dad, I hope you understand what I said last night. It's for your own good. Melissa and I are trying to do what's best for everyone." Thomas studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Maybe you're right, Nathan," he said evenly. "Maybe this house is too much for me now." Nathan blinked, surprised at how easily his father was agreeing. "Really? I've been thinking about it. Maybe I should look into those places you mentioned. Something simple. Somewhere quiet." Thomas stirred his coffee and forced a small, weary smile. "I trust you'll take care of things here." Nathan's shoulders relaxed and the tension left his face. He even smiled, relieved. "You have no idea how much better that makes me feel. Melissa's been worried sick about you." "I'm sure she has," Thomas said, sipping his coffee to hide the flicker of anger in his eyes. The act was convincing enough that Nathan left for work humming, calling Melissa on the way to share the good news. Thomas waited until the front door closed, then walked to the living room and picked up the phone. "Raymond Pierce, attorney at law," came the familiar voice when the line connected. "Ray, it's Thomas Grant." There was a pause, then a warm chuckle. Well, haven't heard from you in ages. How's retirement treating you?" "Not as well as I'd hoped," Thomas said grimly. "I need to talk to you about the house, today, if possible." Raymond's tone shifted, becoming all business. "Bring the deed and any relevant documents. I can fit you in at 3 o'clock. Thomas hung up, gathered the folder, and went upstairs to change into his best jacket. Ellen had always said a man should dress well when he meant business, and today he meant it. At Raymond's office, Thomas laid everything out on the polished oak desk: deed, loan notices, tax papers, while Raymond adjusted his glasses and read carefully. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Legally speaking, Thomas, you're in the clear," Raymond said. "You own this house outright. Nathan has no claim on it. He can't sell it, can't borrow against it, can't do anything without your signature." Relief surged through Thomas like a second heartbeat, followed by something sharper, almost electric. "So, if I wanted to sell it myself—" "You could have it on the market tomorrow," Raymond confirmed. "In this market, you'd get top dollar. Maybe even a bidding war if you price it right." Thomas nodded slowly, his plan beginning to take shape. "I don't want a bidding war. I want a fast sale. Quiet. No time for Nathan to interfere." Raymond smiled faintly, recognizing the glint in Thomas's eye. "I know just the people to call. Investors with cash, no contingencies. You could close within 10 days. "Make it happen," Thomas said. By the time Thomas walked out of the office, the sun was low in the sky, painting the world in gold. His steps felt lighter, his hands steadier. For the first time since Nathan's ultimatum, he was no longer on the defensive. He was moving first, and the thought filled him with a quiet, dangerous satisfaction. That evening, Thomas sat in his recliner and watched Nathan and Melissa laughing in the driveway, carrying grocery bags into the house as if nothing had happened. They had no idea their victory was already slipping through their fingers. Thomas smiled faintly to himself and turned back to the folder on his lap. Tomorrow would be the beginning of their education. Thomas woke early the next morning, long before the first rays of sunlight touched the kitchen window. The house was quiet, Nathan and Melissa still asleep upstairs. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, listening to the creak of the old house settling around him. Today, he thought, is the day everything changes. He started with small things. While Nathan and Melissa were gone for work, Thomas quietly gathered Ellen's jewelry box, their wedding album, and a few other priceless keepsakes from the bedroom. He carried them to the garage where he had already cleared a corner and set up several sturdy boxes. Every item was wrapped carefully in old towels, labeled in his neat handwriting. Next came the files. He boxed up bank statements, tax records, and Ellen's letters. He moved slowly, deliberately, making sure nothing Nathan could use against him was left behind. When Melissa returned in the afternoon, she noticed nothing. To her, it just looked like an old man tidying up a lifetime's worth of clutter. At noon, Thomas drove to meet Raymond again, this time joined by Brian Eastman, a sharply dressed real estate agent who specialized in off-market deals. Brian walked through the house with a professional eye, scribbling notes on his tablet as Thomas watched silently. "This place is immaculate," Brian said, glancing around the kitchen. "Custom cabinetry, solid hardwood, no visible damage anywhere. In this market, you could list at $950,000 and still get a cash buyer within a week." "Do it," Thomas said simply. Brian smiled. "I'll prepare the paperwork tonight. We'll keep it quiet. No public listing, no open houses. Your neighbors won't even know it's on the market until it's sold." By the time Thomas drove back home, his plan was in motion. The house would be under contract in a matter of days, sold before Nathan or Melissa could even smell trouble. That evening, over dinner, Nathan mentioned casually, "I talked to a facility today, Sunset Creek. They have a private room available next month. We can move you in right after we list the house." Thomas looked at him across the table, hiding the smile that threatened to break across his face. "Good to know," he said mildly. "I'll start packing soon." Melissa beamed, pleased at his cooperation. "You'll love it there, Thomas. They have social events, activities, even a game night every Thursday." "I'll keep that in mind," Thomas said, stabbing his fork into his roast. Inside, he felt like laughing. They had no idea the house would belong to someone else by then. 2 days later, Brian returned with a man named George, a representative of a local investment group. George was polite but quick, moving through each room with a practiced eye. "We can close in 10 days, he told Thomas, shaking his hand firmly. "Cash offer, no contingencies. The price is $950,000. "Done," Thomas said. His voice was steady, his handshake firm. The paperwork was signed that very afternoon. As Brian left, he gave Thomas a look of quiet respect. "Most sellers hesitate, but you knew exactly what you wanted." "I've been building things my whole life," Thomas said. "I know when it's time to finish a job." The next week passed in a blur of quiet preparation. Thomas scheduled a locksmith, arranged for a moving company to collect a few large items, and opened a new account at a local credit union where the sale proceeds would be deposited. Each night, Nathan and Melissa returned home laughing, completely unaware that the house they walked into no longer legally belonged to them. On the 9th day, Brian called to confirm. "Funds will be wired tomorrow morning, Mr. Grant. You'll receive confirmation before noon. Congratulations." "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice calm. But when he hung up, he sat for a moment in the silent kitchen, letting the reality wash over him. This house, his house, was already gone. And soon, Nathan and Melissa would find out just how little power they really had. That evening, Thomas changed the locks with the help of the locksmith, paying cash and keeping no paper trail. As the last screw tightened, a deep sense of satisfaction settled in his chest. The fortress was his again, even if only for a short while. Standing in the entryway, he taped a white envelope to the front door at eye level. His handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind of writing Ellen used to say looked too formal for grocery lists. Inside the envelope was the note that would shatter Nathan's illusion of control. He stepped back, staring at the envelope for a long moment. "This is for you, Ellen," he whispered softly. "For every hour we worked, for every dream we built, for every nail I drove into these walls. They thought they could throw me out like a stray dog. They're about to learn who they're dealing with." When Nathan and Melissa came home that night, they found Thomas sitting quietly on the porch swing, looking peaceful, almost serene. Nathan raised an eyebrow. "You okay, Dad?" "Never better," Thomas said, smiling faintly. And for the first time in weeks, he meant it. The morning of the closing day felt electric. Thomas woke before dawn, dressed in the same navy jacket Ellen had bought him for Nathan's high school graduation, and drove to the title office. The meeting was brief, efficient, almost cold in its professionalism. By 10:02 a.m., the money was wired to his new account, nearly $1 million. Thomas shook hands with Brian and George, thanked Raymond for his help, and walked out into the bright sunlight with a steady stride. When he pulled into the driveway later that afternoon, Nathan's car was gone. Perfect. He went inside one last time, touching the familiar walls, the banister Ellen used to polish every spring, the bay window where they'd sat watching summer storms roll through. Then he placed the final piece of his plan, the envelope on the front door. His handwriting was clean, sharp, unshaking. He checked the new locks one last time, tested the keys, and then left, parking his truck a block away where he could watch the house unseen. It was almost sunset when Nathan's black SUV finally turned into the driveway. Melissa climbed out first, looking tired but expectant, like someone coming home to collect a prize. Nathan followed, pulling his suit jacket off and slinging it over one shoulder. They moved toward the door, talking casually about dinner plans. Then Nathan stopped mid-step, frowning at the crisp white envelope taped to the door. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, peeling it off. Melissa shrugged. "Maybe a note from a neighbor?" Nathan tore the envelope open, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and began to read. His face changed almost instantly, the color draining from it as if someone had pulled a plug. Melissa leaned in, reading over his shoulder, her manicured hand flying to her mouth. "My son tried to kick me out. I heard him laugh and say, 'It'll be my house soon.' I didn't argue. I sold the house for $950K. When he came with his lawyer, he found an empty lot and a note that said, 'Check your bank account.'" The words landed like blows. Nathan's hands began to shake. Melissa ripped the letter from him and read it again, her eyes darting back and forth as if hoping the words would change. He sold it." Melissa's voice cracked, an octave higher than usual. "He actually sold it?" Nathan crumpled the paper in his fist. "And he kept all the money." Melissa's shock turned quickly to fury. "Do you know what this means? We have nowhere to live, Nathan. Nowhere. Our lease ends in a week. We were counting on this house." Nathan's jaw tightened, his face flushing red. "He outplayed me," he said through gritted teeth. "He planned this. Every bit of it." Melissa stepped back, glaring at him. "You said you had this under control. You said he'd sign the papers." "I did have it under control," Nathan snapped, "but he broke off, swearing under his breath. Melissa was shaking now, panic setting in. "Do something! Call the bank, call the lawyer, call somebody." "There's nothing to call," Nathan shouted. "The house isn't ours. It never was. And he knew that." The neighbors had begun to gather outside, watching from their yards. Mrs. Harper stood near the curb, arms crossed, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corner of her lips. She had heard every word of the confrontation and was clearly enjoying the spectacle. Melissa noticed the neighbors staring and pulled Nathan toward the car. "Get inside. We're not doing this out here." But Nathan didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the house, his father's house, now legally someone else's. Inside his truck parked a block away, Thomas watched it all unfold through the small live feed on his phone. The hidden camera he had installed in the entryway captured every expression, every argument, every panicked word. He didn't smile, not yet, but the satisfaction was there, quiet and deep, like a storm finally breaking after a long drought. As Melissa stormed back to the car, Thomas finally put the truck in gear. It was time to leave them to stew in the wreckage of their own greed. Nathan stood frozen in the doorway, fists clenched around the crumpled letter as if he could crush the words out of existence. Melissa was pacing back and forth in the driveway, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. The late evening sky had gone from gold to deep purple, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the yard like accusations. "You said this would never happen." Melissa's voice cracked, rising high enough for Mrs. Harper and the other neighbors to hear. "You promised me we'd finally get out from under those loans. You promised this house would fix everything." Nathan turned on her, his face flushed. And whose idea was it to push him so hard? To humiliate him at dinner? If you'd just been patient. "Oh, don't you dare blame me," Melissa snapped, jabbing a finger at his chest. "You're the one who said he was too soft to fight back. You're the one who said we'd get the deed signed before he even knew what hit him." Across the street, Mrs. Harper whispered something to her neighbor, who covered her mouth to hide a smirk. A few more neighbors stepped out onto porches, pretending to check their mail just to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Nathan rubbed his temples, pacing now himself. "We need to think. There has to be a way to reverse this." Melissa stopped short. "Reverse it? With what money, Nathan?" "We don't have a cent left. The investors are still calling, and now we don't even have a house to fall back on. We are broke. Completely broke." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she collapsed onto the front steps, burying her face in her hands. Nathan's jaw worked, but no words came. In his truck down the street, Thomas watched it all on the tiny screen of his phone, the hidden camera capturing every second. He could hear Melissa's sobs, Nathan's heavy breathing, the occasional murmurs of neighbors gathering like spectators at a play. For a moment, Thomas considered driving away then and there. He had won. The house was sold, the money safe, and Nathan's power broken. But something kept him rooted in place. After all the humiliation, after the betrayal, after Nathan's smugness at that dinner table, Thomas wanted to see this through to the very end. Nathan finally sank onto the steps beside Melissa, staring blankly at the yard as if the grass itself had betrayed him. "We'll call Dad," he said at last, his voice low, almost pleading. "We'll apologize. He can't just cut us off like this. He's my father." Melissa lifted her head, mascara streaked down her cheeks. "Do you really think he's going to answer you after what we did?" Nathan hesitated. He knew the answer even before Melissa spoke. Inside the truck, Thomas's phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an incoming call from Nathan. Thomas let it ring, his face expressionless. When it went to voicemail, the phone buzzed again. This time a text message. "Dad, we need to talk. Please call me." Thomas powered the phone off and set it gently on the dashboard. In the driveway, Nathan's anger boiled over. He kicked at the porch railing, shouting, "He can't do this. This is my house. He built it for me." "No, Nathan," Melissa said bitterly. "He built it for himself, for his wife, for his life. You just assumed it would all fall into your lap." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. For once, Nathan didn't have a comeback. Mrs. Ewan Harper finally called out from across the street, her voice carrying clear in the evening stillness. "Looks like Thomas finally got tired of being pushed around, Nathan. Maybe you ought to think about why he had to do it." Nathan spun toward her, face red, but Mrs. Harper just shook her head and turned back toward her house. By the time the neighbors drifted back inside, the street had fallen silent again. Nathan sat on the steps, staring at the envelope still clutched in his hand. Melissa eventually stood and walked toward the car. "Where are you going?" Nathan demanded. "To my sister's," she said flatly. "At least she has a couch." And then she was gone, leaving Nathan alone in the driveway, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Thomas watched for one more long moment, then started the truck. The engine's low rumble cut through the quiet night as he pulled away, leaving Nathan sitting on the porch of a house that no longer belonged to him. Thomas drove in silence for a long time, the glow of the dashboard illuminating his calm, weathered face. The city lights stretched out ahead of him, a ribbon of possibility. For the first time in years, he didn't feel weighed down by the house, by Nathan's expectations, by anyone's plans but his own. He pulled into the quiet parking lot of the Highlands Crest Apartments just as the last light of dusk faded. The complex was modest but well kept, with flower beds along the entrance and warm yellow lights glowing in each window. It was nothing like the big family home he'd just left behind. No sprawling lawn, no creaking stairs, no memories clinging to every corner. And maybe that was exactly what he needed. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of new paint and carpet cleaner. The furniture was simple. A single armchair by the window, a small kitchen table, a neatly made bed. Thomas placed the box he had carried from the truck on the counter and opened it carefully. Ellen's jewelry box went on the dresser, the wedding photo on the nightstand, the album of memories on the shelf by the window. He stood back, surveying the room. It wasn't home yet, but it was his space. His choice. That alone made it feel lighter than anything he'd felt in years. The next morning, Thomas brewed coffee in the small kitchen and sat by the window watching early joggers pass by. No one knew him here. No one expected anything from him. He wasn't Dad or Grandpa or the old man in the big house. He was just Thomas Grant, retired builder, starting over. He opened his laptop and logged into the new credit union account. The wire transfer was complete. Nearly $1 million stared back at him, and for a moment, he felt an unexpected wave of grief. Not for the money, but for what it had cost him to get here. For Ellen, who would have hated to see their son turn into someone capable of betrayal. For Nathan, who might never understand why his father had to do what he did. Thomas closed the laptop and exhaled slowly. "We did what we had to do, Ellen," he murmured toward the wedding photo. "We kept the promise. We didn't let them take everything we worked for." Later that afternoon, Thomas drove to a nearby furniture store and bought a few small items: a reading lamp, a second chair, a soft rug for the living room. As the delivery men set everything in place, the apartment began to feel a little warmer, a little less like a stranger's space. When evening came, he decided to walk to the small cafe he'd noticed the day before. Bruce and Views was quiet, filled with the smell of fresh coffee and soft music playing from hidden speakers. The barista, a young woman with purple streaks in her hair, greeted him with a cheerful smile. "New around here?" she asked as she handed him his order. "Just moved in," Thomas said with a small smile. "Thought I'd try the place out." "Well, welcome to the neighborhood. You picked a good spot. Peaceful, but never boring," she said with a wink. Thomas sat by the window sipping his coffee slowly and watching the last light fade over the mountains. For the first time since Ellen's death, he felt a sense of forward motion, not just surviving, but living again. That night he called Raymond to thank him one last time. "You saved me, Ray," Thomas said. "No, Tom," Raymond replied. "You saved yourself. I just handed you the tools. You did the hard part." After hanging up, Thomas poured himself a glass of Ellen's favorite Bordeaux from the single bottle he'd brought from the house. He lifted it toward her photo, the deep red liquid catching the soft lamplight. "To you, Ellen," he said quietly. "To everything we built, and to the fact that no one will ever take it from us again." He drank deeply, letting the wine burn just enough to remind him he was still alive. Outside, the city was quiet, the streetlights casting soft halos on the empty road. Somewhere across town, Nathan was probably still sitting in that driveway, still seething, still trying to figure out how everything had slipped through his fingers. Thomas didn't need to watch it happen anymore. The lesson had been delivered, loud and clear. He turned off the lamp, climbed into bed, and for the first time in years, slept without waking in the middle of the night. 3 days later, Thomas received a notification on his phone. The live camera feed from his old house had captured motion. Curious, he opened the app. The new owners were moving in, unloading boxes from a truck. Strangers were walking through the home he had built, their laughter echoing down hallways that had once held Christmas mornings and birthday dinners. But Thomas didn't feel sadness. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of completion. The house was starting a new life, just like he was. Later that afternoon, Thomas stopped by the credit union to finalize some paperwork with the bank manager. As they spoke, Thomas mentioned a small request to have a cashier's check issued for a certain amount and mailed to one of his creditors. When the manager asked for clarification, Thomas smiled faintly. "It's not for me," he said. "It's to settle a debt my son couldn't pay." The manager hesitated, then nodded. "A generous move?" "Not generosity," Thomas replied quietly. "Closure." That evening, Thomas returned to his apartment and found an envelope slipped under the door. It was a letter from Nathan, written in his hurried, uneven handwriting. "Dad, you won. Melissa left. The bank accounts are empty. The investors are threatening to sue. I don't know what to do anymore. If there's any part of you that still sees me as your son, call me." Thomas read it twice, then folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer with Ellen's photo. He did not call. Instead, he spent the next morning packing a picnic basket and driving out to the lake on the edge of town, a place he and Ellen had once visited on weekends when Nathan was little. The sun glittered on the water, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine. Sitting at a weathered picnic table, Thomas poured himself a cup of coffee and took out the last of Ellen's favorite lemon bars from the bakery. Around him, families laughed and children played, and for a moment, he could almost feel Ellen sitting across from him, smiling that soft, approving smile. "You'd be proud of me," he said aloud, as if she could hear him. "I didn't let them take what we built. I made them remember whose name was on the deed." When he drove back into town later that afternoon, he passed his old neighborhood one last time. Nathan's SUV was parked crookedly in the driveway, the trunk open, boxes scattered on the lawn. Nathan stood in the yard, shouting into his phone, his face red with frustration. The new owners watched from the porch, clearly unimpressed. Thomas slowed just enough for Nathan to notice him. Their eyes met for a brief, charged moment. Nathan's expression flickered from rage to shame to something almost pleading. Thomas didn't stop. He simply gave a slow nod, not of forgiveness, but of finality, and drove on. When he reached the end of the street, Mrs. Harper stepped out onto her porch and waved. "Looks like they finally got what was coming to them, Thomas," she called out. He rolled down the window, smiling for the first time in what felt like years. "Yes," he said simply, "they did." Back at his apartment that night, Thomas lit a single candle and poured himself the last glass of Bordeaux. He sat in the quiet, staring out at the lights of the city below. There was no gloating, no anger left, just peace. He took a sip, raised the glass toward Ellen's photo, and said softly, "We're free now." And for the first time since she had passed, Thomas felt like he was no longer living in the shadow of loss. He was no longer a man waiting to be discarded. He was a man who had taken back control of his life and made sure the ones who betrayed him would never forget it. As the candle flickered and the night deepened, Thomas leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his face. The house was gone, the money was his, and Nathan's plan had crumbled to dust. Justice had been served. Tomorrow would be a new day, and for the first time in a long time, it would belong entirely to him.